When I first saw that the Ronbus Quanta was a Gen 4 priced at 170 Canadian dollars, I got very excited, but my main question was, can it compete with the best and significantly more expensive Gen 4s in terms of pure performance? Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So I've been testing the Ronbus Quanta for the last couple of weeks, and there's definitely a lot to talk about with this paddle. Value is obviously extremely important, and I will talk about that throughout the video, but I also wanted to review it on its own merits independent of that price point, because I also think that pure performance is important, especially if you're going to be trying to play at a high level. Now before we get into the review, let me remind you that if you want to check out all of these new Quantas or any of the paddles that we carry at the store, you can visit us on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comments section what you want me to cover next. So first, let's talk about the specs, technology, and construction with all these paddles, and let's also talk a little bit about the shapes because there are a lot. There are 5 Quantas, the R1, the R2, the R3, the R4, and the R5, and all those numbers basically entail a different shape for each, but also all the Quantas share the same technology, so I'm going to talk about that before I get into any of those specs. The Quantas are Gen 4s, meaning they have a full foam core, which is obviously the most exciting thing about these paddles because they are significantly less expensive than any of their competitors. The center of the core is made from EPP foam, which is denser, more durable, and less springy than the EVA foam ring that wraps around it. That EVA foam is similar to what we see with Gen 3 power paddles like the Yola Pro 4s, and it's designed to add power, pop, and a trampoline effect, but that EVA foam only goes to about 3/4 of the way down the paddle face. At the bottom here, Ronbus has added TPE elastomer inserts, which improve stability and dampen vibrations. These inserts aren't springy like the EVA foam, so they lean more towards control and stability. Then on the outside of all that foam, there is a small carbon grid layer. I think this is similar to the carbon grid that's in the Nova and FX series. It's got that adaptive quality to it, and Ronbus claims that it's primarily there to add even more spring effect. Then finally, the handle is made from carbon and wrapped with EPP foam. Now I want to talk a little bit more about this handle real quick. Those of you who played with the Ronbus Ripple know that that handle was really squishy and really didn't feel very premium at all. This is totally different. It's got a little bit of plushness to it, but definitely not in a sloppy way. It's just a little bit more comfortable, but generally speaking, this is much more in line with Ronbus's non-Ripple handles, which are some of my favorite in the whole industry. Then to top it all off, the Quantas have a Toray T700 carbon top sheet, so pretty standard stuff there. Now let's talk about the specs because there are a lot, and I'm going to start with the one that I spent most time on court with, the R3 that I have here. This is Ronbus's standard elongated shape. It's 16.5 inches long with a 5.5 inch handle. It weighs 7.8 ounces plus or minus 0.2 ounces. It's 16 millimeters thick and has a grip circumference of 4.2 inches. Now the swing weight and twist weight are very interesting. This has a 112 swing weight and a 5.64 twist weight, which are very low compared to other elongated paddles, and I'll talk about that a lot more once I get into playability. Moving on to the R4, which is the other paddle that I got from Ronbus. This is a hybrid paddle, which is a fairly new shape for the brand. It's 16.25 inches long with a 5.5 inch handle, which is quite long for a hybrid paddle. You can see here, compared to the J2 NFT, which does have a very short handle for a hybrid paddle, this is pretty significantly longer. That just means more space to put 2 hands on the paddle, and it's also going to be a lot more maneuverable and whippy, but obviously you're going to be sacrificing some stability and sweet spot size. Now this paddle weighs the same as the R3 and it's also 16 millimeters thick. The swing weight is 104 and the twist weight is 5.78, which again are really low numbers, and that's true across the board for all the Quantas. Then the R1 is also elongated, but it has that Hyperion Aero curve shape to it, which is a little bit more aerodynamic. Otherwise, it's 16.5 inches long, same thickness, same weight, 5.5 inch handle with a 108 swing weight and 5.58 twist weight. The R2 is their wide body option, so it's 16 inches long, 5.5 inch handle, 16 millimeters thick, same static weight as all the others with a 102 swing weight and 6.34 twist weight. And finally, the R5 is a very interesting shape. It looks like a hybrid with the flared paddle face, but it's actually 16 inches long, so standard length. The handle's also 5.5 inches, it's also 16 millimeters thick, 7.8 ounces plus or minus 2. Those specs are all the same across the board. And then finally, the swing weight is 102 with a twist weight of 6.23. Unfortunately, I didn't get to test the R1, the R2, and the R5, but again, all these paddles share the same technology and construction, so whatever I say from here on out, you can kind of apply to those, but again, just keep in mind they are different shapes. I know I spent a lot of time on the specs there, but I did want to cover everything. Now we can finally get into the playability, which I'm very excited to talk about, and we're going to start with the feel. So right off the bat, I want to talk about something that a lot of other reviewers have already brought up, these really low swing weight and twist weight specs. I'm not entirely sure why Ronbus did this, but all of these paddles are just too light in the paddle face. Yes, that makes them very maneuverable, but they just don't have the necessary stability, plow through, sweet spot size, and leverage to be playable in stock form. Some of you may be thinking, well, I don't have a power-oriented game, so plow through and leverage aren't that important to me, but the lack of a forgiving sweet spot is pretty much a deal breaker in my opinion, and that applies to pretty much everybody. I only played with the R4 in stock form, mainly to compare it to the R3 that I had customized pretty heavily, and there's just not enough behind the ball here. Now, if you watch my review of the True Foam Genesis paddles, you'll know that I had a similar issue when I first tested them, but this is quite a bit more noticeable, especially that feel in stock form is just very disconnected from the ball. It almost feels like a toy. So I really wouldn't recommend playing these in stock form, but that's not too important. Customization exists. You've got lead tape and tungsten tape, and once I added some to my R4, that completely transformed it. All those issues I had with feel, stability, plow through, and sweet spot got significantly better. Now let me tell you exactly how much I added to it and where before I get more into specifics about that playability. I added about 17 inches of lead tape to both sides of the paddle, which I know may seem like a lot, but those weight specs are so low that that's how much you need to add to make this feel and swing like a normal elongated paddle. Honestly, I think that's the swing weight these paddles were designed to play with. I'm gonna bounce a ball on the customized R3 and the stock R4 because you can actually hear a difference between the two. This is the R4, and this is the R3. The customized R3 has much more of that hollow, powerful sound to it. This almost sounds like the ball is just not going deep enough into the paddle to get there. So again, I really think that this is how the paddles were designed to play. So from here on out, I'm going to talk about a Quanta's customized performance. Let's start with the feel. With that extra weight, that sort of toyish and ambiguous feel is gone. You get a lot more feedback, and it actually has quite a unique feel. First of all, it's more powerful than the average Gen 4 paddle. It's sort of similar to the J2NF in that you get some of that muted Gen 4 feel, but also with the increased trampoline effect of a Gen 3. The main difference is that it's way more raw feeling than the NF, and not necessarily in a good way. Obviously, the feel was much better than without lead, but I still felt a little disconnected from the ball. It's almost like there's this separation between the EPP foam and that EVA foam where the transition point where you get more power is a little random. And compared to the NF, I just think Honolulu has a slightly smoother feel throughout. The other paddle that has a similar construction is the boomstick, and for me, that gap in playability is even more stark between the two. The boomstick just feels like a much more refined, more connected take on this dual density foam. Of course, we are talking about three completely different price points between these paddles, so it's obviously not the most fair comparison to make, but again, I do think it is important to compare that performance. Now moving on to the sweet spot, which again, that gets significantly better with lead tape, but it's also still not quite as big and forgiving as other Gen 4 paddles. A big sweet spot is one of the main benefits to a Gen 4 construction. Now, it's definitely not bad here, but I did just find there was a noticeable drop-off in playability when I made perfect contact versus when I was a little bit off-center. We're gonna move on from feel and stability now, but I think the main thing to take away is that the Quanta feels like a Gen 4, but it's also a little bit more raw and less refined than the others that I've tested, and considering the price it's coming in at, that really shouldn't be too surprising. The Quanta is first and foremost a power paddle, which is a little bit different to what we've seen with most Gen 4s so far, but we are starting to get a lot more of these more power-oriented Gen 4s like the Boomstick and the J2NF. I wanted to talk about power and control together because I think they're very related here, and that's because the Quanta basically is always adding power onto the ball. Again, that's different to most Gen 4s, which kind of went away from that all-out, all-the-time power of Gen 3 technology. But remember, the Quantas do have that EVA foam ring, which is more powerful than the interior foam. There is a spring effect every time you make contact with the ball here. Now, for power on big swings, that's fantastic. In fact, I would put this power level slightly under the boomstick, but noticeably more than other Gen 4s. It's still a little bit lower than the average Gen 3, and that's just because there is less dwell time here. It's a firmer overall feel, which means that the ball has less time to load up on spring effect while it's in the paddle face. Whether it's on serve, on drives, or even when you have time to load up on a full swing volley up at the net, there is a ton of put away power, and I really didn't find myself needing any more, even when I did compare it to the boomstick. It's obviously nice to have that little bit extra, but it's really not necessary. Now, I do just want to remind you that I'm talking about its power when it's customized. In stock form, it's not nearly as powerful, and that's because the LED gives you that extra dwell time you need to tap into that trampoline effect. Pop is also excellent here, again, because that trampoline effect is always kicking in, so even if you don't have time to load up on a volley and you have to hit a more compact stroke, you still get plenty of punch. Now, countering pace up at the net is a little bit tougher, not because it lacks pop, but because it has that small sweet spot. You need to react so quickly to a speed up that you don't always have time to make perfect contact, and that's where the drop off in playability outside the sweet spot does hurt you a little bit. If you're not making contact right in the middle of the paddle face, it just doesn't perform nearly as well, and it's a little bit unstable too, so you'll lose some of the ball's energy as the paddle flutters. But overall, power and pop are excellent, especially for players who are really precise with their strokes. Now, of course, there is a downside to a paddle that has so much power and pop all the time, and that's control. I did struggle in the control game with this paddle for a couple of reasons, but the main one was just controlling how launchy it is. Dinking is okay just because there's not too much variety to the ball you're hitting, and the ball that's coming at you is already low powered, which makes it easier to control, but it's still not a great performer up there. If you want to vary your dinks at all, especially if you want to hit those two-handed backhand dinks with spin, you're going to have to accelerate your paddle face, and that's where the extra power becomes tougher to control. The dwell time is still relatively short, and there's also that lack of a really well-defined transition point between less trampoline effect and more, and that just makes it quite easy to accidentally pop the ball up. I spent a lot of time testing this in the kitchen, playing some cross-court games to 11, and I never really felt 100% confident with it. Now, control from the mid-court and baseline was even tougher because that's where that randomness becomes even more of a problem. You're dealing with less consistent and much more powerful shots back there, usually because your opponent has the upper hand. To hit a good drop, you really want to feel the ball, you want dwell time, and ideally you want some softness to the paddle. This is definitely not soft, the dwell time is fairly short, and that feel is, again, too ambiguous to really feel super confident and consistent. I pretty quickly realized that I wasn't going to get to a point where I was really confident with it in the touch game away from the kitchen, and that's okay, there are a lot of paddles like that. The good news is there are other ways of resetting the ball and even taking over a point from the baseline. Spin is something that high-level players can use to put their opponents in a difficult position, even when they're on the back foot, so now let's talk about that spin. When a paddle is very powerful and not very controlled in the touch game, you need it to be spin friendly because that's how you're going to control the ball. So the question is spin good on the Quanta? Yes, in general, this is a very spin friendly paddle, especially when you generate that full stroke with core rotation and that proper spin technique. It responds very well to that. I actually really liked serving with this paddle because of that combination of good top end spin and really high power. I could hit really loose and really fast serves because I was confident that the spin would bring it down before the baseline. That's actually a pretty underrated characteristic in a paddle, how well it serves. Back in the day, you obviously couldn't really bother your opponent on serve, but now that these paddles are so powerful, you can definitely use it as a weapon. I think the most important thing is that your serve is deep enough and powerful enough to make it as difficult as possible for your opponent to come up to the net. I'm not saying I was doing that every time here, but a lot of my serves were difficult to return. Compared to a lot of the lower power Gen 4s like the FC Plus and even the Genesis, this is very clearly better on serve. It's up there with the NF, obviously not as good as the boomstick, but still great for serving. Then on ground strokes, it's also very good. The one thing I will say is that, again, the sweet spot is quite small, so you really want to make sure that you're making good contact every time you're swinging big. The quality of ball that the paddle generates when you're a little bit off is much lower than when you're in the sweet spot, so you could be in for a bad surprise if you're not dialed, and I definitely went through that a few times. Sometimes there was just not enough power on my ball and it went into the net, or it just didn't generate the spin I thought it would and my ball went went flying. So just be careful, you need to be on top of your game when you're swinging big. Now let's talk about soft spin, and to be honest, I didn't have the highest expectations because of my past experiences with paddles that are firmer like this and also have a ton of power and pop. Soft spin is really closely related to the touch game just because you need that subtlety and those little nuances and feel. And like I've said a few times now, this paddle's just a little bit too ambiguous to get the feedback you need for that. I definitely tried to hit a few touch spin shots, but again, kind of like with the touch game, I realized that wasn't the forte here. So instead I stuck to powerful spinny shots when I was backed into a corner. I personally need the soft spin game because it's actually something I'm fairly decent at, and it's a real advantage I have over my opponents. So I don't think I could ever switch to this paddle, but if that's not your game style, then you'd be totally fine. Now I want to make it clear that I had really high hopes for the Quanta, and it didn't disappoint. You have to keep in mind, this paddle plays closest to the J2NF and the Boomstick. The J2NF is $100 more, the Boomstick is $300 more. A little part of me thought that maybe this was going to be as good as the Boomstick, but the fact that it's not shouldn't be too much of a surprise, and while I don't think that the Boomstick's price is justified, at least this shows that there is some method to that madness. I don't think any pickleball paddle should cost $460, but there is a gap in playability between the two, so I guess that's a good thing. This hasn't just come in and rendered any more expensive paddle useless. I think the biggest thing when comparing the Quanta with those more expensive paddles is that those just feel a little bit more refined in the way they play, which makes them marginally better at pretty much everything. This is quite a raw take on what is obviously a pretty complex design in a dual density foam Gen 4, and it has all the characteristics you'd want from that style of paddle, just not quite on the level of its expensive competitors. So I think if you want a more powerful Gen 4 that's going to last a solid amount of time, you're fine with customizing a paddle, again, that's very important here, and you're also okay knowing that there is better performance if you're willing to spend a lot of money, then this is a great paddle for you. It ticks all those boxes, it's probably the best performing paddle in its price bracket, or at least the most technologically impressive. The one thing I will say is that this is a very power-oriented paddle that doesn't do very well in the soft game. So if you are shopping around this price point and you want something very well-rounded, I'd probably look somewhere else. But if you are, say, new to pickleball and you come from a racket sports background, this is pretty much the perfect paddle for you because this is the style of paddle that complements the technique you've learned from other sports, especially tennis. So I'm sure the Quanta is going to be extremely popular. In terms of value, it's definitely in a league of its own right now, but it's also not the greatest paddle of all time, and that's totally fine. But with that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo any of these new Quantas, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.